Welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. My name is Egberto Willies, your host. Today, we're honored to have Patrick Lovell. Once again, Patrick Lovell is the producer of The Con, where he discussed the fraudulent mortgage shenanigans that took down the economy in 2008. Today, we continue the series, how the billionaire class got away with their power accumulation over the last 14 years. Lovell calls himself the producer with the $71 trillion truth that the entire system depends on and hid from everyone that still doesn't get it. Senor Patrick Lovell, talk to me. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm really looking forward to this dialogue. I think we've got some amazing things to sink our teeth into. But just as a point of reference, the idea of this being shenanigans means we need to reinterpret the idea of shenanigans. Shenanigans should become racketeering. I think a lot of people just kind of think about shenanigans as boys will be boys. People behind the scenes who are rich, you go to country clubs, you make plans, think along the same ways and might do some tricks to do some stuff that might have some specific outcomes. Because I recall Hillary Rodham Clinton had made the same sort of corollary to, of course, Goldman Sachs. But what Goldman Sachs was doing was racketeering.
Yeah, let me tell you, shenanigans, by definition, you're right. The interesting thing about it is most people understand shenanigans. Very few people understand the technicalities of which we speak. So we bring all of you in with shenanigans, and then we'll have Patrick Lovell redirect what these shenanigans really are. And in effect, racketeering and much more. Anyway, let's continue. Today, we're going to talk about the billionaire domination. The previous issues spoke about the now, followed by the election and what it really entails. We covered that the last time, Patrick. But today, the billionaire domination, we're going to go in more detail. And we're going to start with, over the course of the last 14 years, we've had billionaire kleptocracy. For those who don't know what kleptocracy is, let them have it, Patrick.
Well, it was funny. The first time I had heard the term kleptocracy was by none other than CNN's African-American go-to liberal, whose name he worked in the Obama administration. I admit I interviewed him right in front of the Capitol, as a matter of fact. Can you think of his name? I could look it up.
I don't remember off the top, but I know who you mean. Go ahead.
Anyway, he's one of the go-to guys on CNN. But I had interviewed him for my first film, and he brought up the notion of kleptocracy. And I thought, okay, that makes sense. That means you steal. It's an organization. It's an organization of powerful people that have influence within the parameters of power, and they are stealing. Whom are they stealing from? Well, the idea at that time was they were stealing from the American people. And it was interesting to me that he had identified this actually coming out of the Obama administration and becoming kind of a go-to guy that a lot of people were listening to right around the time of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I had interviewed him for my first film. And I've since learned the terms caucusocracy, which is, I think, ruled by the least equipped to rule, the most ignorant.
Wait. What was that? I don't think I knew that one. What was that one?
Caucusocracy. It's been used a lot by other people, particularly online indie media, like Kyle Kulinski likes to use that one a lot, to describe Trump and his minions and the likes of Matt Gaetz and everybody else that he's putting into, positions of the cabinet that aren't qualified and are actually literal criminals nonetheless, right? And so the notion of all of these things are answers to democracy, right? Or alternatives to what we think we are, which is a democracy. Now, interestingly, I had discovered most of these terms literally go back thousands of years to ancient Greece and to the nature of probably the most insightful philosopher at that time, which was, I'm mixing up some of my philosophers, but I'll come back to it. But it was absolutely extraordinary to think that a lot of these systems had been identified literally thousands of years ago, because this is the nature of how power works, right? So what is kleptocracy? Well, kleptocracy is a government of, by, and for powerful entities that are obviously looting the population.
And pretty much looting it is. Now, what was the 2008 the GFC, the collapse that occurred in 2008? What really happened?
Well, you got to think that there's a reason we call it the American dream for a reason. So we established home ownership in the United States approximately right after the Great Depression, but mostly during the aftermath of World War II, where the American middle class, the working class, had an opportunity to get its piece of ownership that would increase in appraised value over years, which was an investment into their family, into their community, into everything that would foster ultimately what would become this nation that grew the largest, strongest, most powerful, educated, and let's say enlightened population of voters that held power to account in the history of the world. Now, interestingly enough, I had no idea that it was so unique in world history until I actually had to run through all of these scenarios to deconstruct what exactly created the 2008 great financial crisis. Mm-hmm. So there was a time where the housing market was the most stable investment in all of the parameters in the panoply of investment in the entire world. The home ownership category included the magnitude of AAA investment in massive loans that nobody would ever fail to pay back. Why? Because at that time period, as you may recall, Egberto, and especially coming from Panama, I'm sure you looked into the lens of the United States to think, well, why isn't that the story around the world? Well, we had a middle class for a reason. We had an industrial middle class. We had a working class that had working class wages and the opportunity through insurance and income and education and all of the other things that would ultimately foster this dynamic, burgeoning middle class that which no one who had a job would ever foreclose on their payments for a home that was the sanctity and the safety of the white picket fence in the middle class, i.e. the American dream. Everything was aligned and everything was in balance such that the American economy grew by leaps and bounds in ways that we had never seen in the history of the world. And of course, most of that could be attributed to the aftermath of the World War II, the Great War, because the United States wasn't decimated like the rest of the world was, quite frankly. And we also won the war. So we were actually exporting the rebuild of everything that took place around the world, which dramatically impacted the opportunity for the industrial middle class to form in the United States, which gave us the AAA golden goose of the American dream, i.e. consumption. And so by the time you get into the 70s, things start to change slightly. Financiers start to realize that you can refinance your houses, you could put them into massive securities that would manifest primarily through a gentleman by the name of Lou Ranieri's sort of, shall we say, his thinking outside of the box, because these financiers had to figure out ways to be able to create more and more loans because the financial impact to the United States and the growth, quite frankly, of us as an economic superpower depended largely on the supremacy of our economic model that enabled this home ownership. But the way we got to this situation in the 70s was the industrial upper middle class, or I should say middle class, began to wane because we started to get into the nature of globalization. Many people refer to that as neoliberalism, where ultimately the United States would become the middleman between industrialization that got farmed out to countries all over the world. And then ultimately we would not have as balanced as, shall we say, significant as our lock, stock, and barrel middle class. And so these investors began to find creative ways to continue to finance home ownership in a way that would appear on the books to create phenomenal growth for the American dream. But what was happening at that time was the facade of the savings and loan crisis. Prior to having too big to fail banks, we had the savings and loans all over the United States providing loans to middle-class Americans so that they could purchase homes. And people weren't flipping homes at that time. But ultimately what took place was there was this imbalance, there was this spread between the amount of money that depositors could keep in these savings and loans and how much interest savings and loans could offer those depositors while maintaining growth by providing loans. So what they started doing was manipulating the costs and the asset value of the houses, as we all know, go into the nature of value, value to home equity that enables people to refinance loans. And so ultimately, by the time you get through this 80s to 90s panoply, where the middle class continued to erode, we ended up trying to balance the imbalance of losing the golden goose of consumerism, and we replaced it with the model of financialization. Go ahead.
I want to stop you right there to explain something to the audience based on what you're saying. Our economic system has always been an unsustainable model. I want Patrick to remember where he's at, but I need to interject this here. And what Patrick just explained is the perfect answer to what many of us talk about, the unsustainability of the American economic system, the capitalist economic system. If you understand what he just said, you understand that these guys needed to maintain growth, but that their widgets were not there. The widgets being you, the home owner, you, the purchaser, you, the person who do all you, the one that creates economic activity, your purchasing power, both for homes and otherwise. But since you were stagnant and these guys had to maintain their growth, what they had to do were, I'm going to say shenanigans. He's going to say different forms of racketeering to fool the market into believing you are still spending, you are still in a sustainable model, so that then they could continue profiting on you. They needed you for the profits. Continue, my dear brother.
That's an extremely important point by way of how banks make money. They make money on fees. They make the volume on fees, generating more and more loans. And there's a process by way of making those loans part of the panoply of what has to take place within the investment community, particularly called AAA. Because AAA, when you securitize thousands and thousands of American homes, you put them into a category that is then sold on Wall Street to pensioners, those that actually are the working class, people that work in the factories, people that work for the police department, so on and so forth. But they have pensions that they're putting away for retirement. And those pensions that they're all invested in are invested because these securities had been determined to be AAA based on the underwriting standards. Now, you just pointed out something extremely important, because what they did was they had to create a facade over decades, because the middle class continued to be withered away. Why? Because of what we call modern executive compensation. That is exactly what it sounds like. That's for the CEOs, the board of directors, and the executives that come down, particularly those that are invested. But the idea is that it's also connected and calibrated to the pensioners of this country that are actually being managed by the same financial industry that's in the mix. There was a point of no return when we got rid of the golden goose, where we produced more than we consumed, where there was an upshot for the American dynamic middle class to consume what it had produced, and then led to the stability of the actual ownership class, were people who owed their homes, paid their taxes, had neighborhoods that we all kind of think of: the white picket fence, the public school down the street with great public education, the police, the fire stations, all the rest of it, which of course their taxes are supposedly paying for. They are by way of state taxes. But all of this is fundamentally generated by an economy that provides jobs, right? So ultimately that started to wane, and they had to come up with quick get rich quick schemes to be able to manifest the facade that the innovation of the American financial system could be able to replace what was stable, unionized middle class, where we had a dynamic American economy where the middle class could thrive. That didn't work for the financial class. The financial class had to create a situation, and yes, it is capitalism, okay? Capitalism is capital. There is no question. capital being used to generate profit. How does it generate that profit? We could look at millions of different industries and come up with all the different verticals and what the actual business model is. But in the case of manufacturing the facade of the middle class during the 80s and the 90s, to create something that would replace the vacuum of the jobs that were sent overseas, the automobile manufacturing and everything that had basically departed the United States in the 70s. What they ended up doing was they created this get-rich-quick scheme where it was like, create liar's loans, create situations they could move fast enough to where the yields on their securities would look on paper to be high, percentage relationships to the actual stock value. So when the stock market started to go up, the idea was the economy is going up. But that's all predicated on what we call modern executive compensation, quite simply, that the executives have to generate more and more revenue per quarter, of which they get paid bonuses. Now, how that worked in the housing market was we got to a point of no return after 9/11. The economy was stagnant. President Bush at the time was, as you may recall, was saying, look, we don't have to institute a draft. We're going to have this war on terror. All you have to do is keep consuming. Well, how is that possible? Well, you get into loans that you can't afford, which might have been the housing industry, which was actually the lead part of the economy during this time period, particularly from about 2002 to 2008. And everybody started getting into flipping houses as well, or refinancing, or whatever the case may be. So, for example, in our prolific work, The Con, we discovered a woman out of the Northeast Ohio, an African-American woman who had lived in her house for over 3-4 decades, because her and her husband were, quite frankly, the expression of the American dream of African Americans escaping Jim Crow. They evolved, they moved to the Midwest. They worked in the factories. They got a piece of the American dream. And then she lived on a fixed income on her husband's retirement after he had passed away. Pretty common story amongst African Americans. If they got past all of the brutal redlining and everything else that actually this particular family did. And so Addie Polk, at the end of this situation, as most seniors, and today this is a big part of a lot of challenges in the United States, and it has been, quite frankly, going back to the Great Depression, but the seniors couldn't keep up with their cost of living because of medication, rising costs of everything. And so suddenly, if someone comes and tells you that your house is worth monumentally more than what you paid for it, you can use that house to refinance based on modern value that's fueling the modern executive compensation of turning loans faster and faster and faster and more volume, so that CEOs and the executive class can get more and more bonus stuff, which the entire paradigm is developed on. And it got to a point where they could no longer maintain the value of the houses with the loans without lying about all of the different parameters that go into making those loans possible. That's what we call liar's loans. So when I talk about racketeering versus shenanigans, what we've shown you, just like any organized crime, all organized crime works the same way. There's a methodology to how the business model is run. And in this particular case, starting with the savings and loan crisis and expanding through the Enron era frauds, the tech bubble frauds, and then ultimately into the housing bubble bust, was that we continued to say you can constantly refinance because the appraisal value of your house will constantly go up. And oh yeah, by the way, do you know how they were fueling this stuff from the beginning? Demand from around the world. We shipped out our middle class to Asia, purchased a lot of fossil fuel matrix from the Middle East, that sort of thing. A lot of money went overseas, and they started to have a burgeoning middle class, of which they started to invest
and they bought some of those derivatives. In fact,
they bought tons. There was $70 trillion worth of global appetite that was fueling these CEOs on Wall Street going, sell, to get this, they incentivize through what we call liar's loans. And there's a whole methodology that we show you in The Con at www.thecon.tv, which is the blueprint for the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in the history of the world. But what it led to Okay. What it led to is what you had said right from the very beginning. It's a facade. If there's not growth in economic development and people making more and more money, can they facilitate higher and higher values on real estate? Is that possible?
No, it's not possible, but they got it done again using
because of the facade. And
right.
So what ultimately happened is when the whole thing collapsed based on tens of millions of illegal documents, used in illegal loans. They were all liars' loans. In fact, the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission had revealed that there was over 80% of our market between 2004 and 2007 were predicated on these illegal loans. That's from the government's investigation following the great financial crisis that nobody in the American public still to this day understands actually happened. And so all of these liars' loans were baked into securities that then went into derivatives that went into the modern executive compensation that grew a $4 trillion housing bubble into an $800 trillion global calamity based on racketeering, lies, deception, falsification of business records, all of the elements that the United States government, per our previous discussion, have been indicting Donald Trump on for different reasons, but same methodology. And when it all blew up, what happened? In capitalism, if something is destroyed because of stupidity, greed, or other elements like that,
it should be left alone.
It's supposed to go away.
Yes.
Or go to jail.
Right.
One or the other. What did we do?
Bail them out.
We ended up giving in 2009. Go ahead.
No, go finish that thought because I want to explain something to the audience after that thought.
What we did was we didn't do the investigation to reveal everything that I'm talking about, even though we did. The FCIC turned out to be a smoke and mirrors, not unlike other major investigations that never revealed what they were supposed to reveal, which is the truth. But ultimately what happened, because you got to put this into perspective, the federal government's investigation inquiry and the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, the budget was $11 million.
Wow, that's so much, right?
Right. Well, okay, so let's put that in the context. Wall Street walked in 2009 with $33 trillion. And that was the beginning of this, what becomes the $71 trillion truth that I'm revealing to you.
Let me add something to that, because I want people to understand the level of thievery that went on here. You heard Patrick speak about derivatives. In other words, the way they packetize these loans and sold them as securities to other countries, meaning like they packetize it and sold it like you have a piece of stock or a bond or whatever. They sold it to other people. And the way they got around knowing that there were bad loans in it is coming up with a mathematical formula that they claimed made these bonds that they were selling, these derivatives, somehow good. In other words, the risk was low because they packetized super high good loans with poor loans. And even if a few of the poor loans failed, that security itself would maintain a good, solid value. What they didn't tell you is that, as Patrick also stated in the narrative he just gave, that at near the end of this sequence, about 80% of the loans were liars' loans, which means that security that was supposed to be built on several different levels of risk were not. They were a whole bunch of bad loans packetized to look like good loans and by the way, a lot of the better investors, what they do when they buy bonds is they also insure them. So when they insure them, if the bond fails, the securities fail, some insurance company would compensate them for the face value of said failure. But here's the issue. We had the circular insurance that occurred. Insurance A insured B, B insured C, C insured D. But guess who insured D? A. So if A failed and eventually D has to pay, D goes to A. But guess what? A failed. That is what's called the deadly embrace. And that's what brought down our economy. Continue, my brother.
Well, it's really well said. I mean, a lot of that, elements that you're referring to are called credit default swaps, and then there's also collateralized debt obligations, and then different versions of that wind up in the derivatives. But the notion of what you just said, a very important thing to understand: when you insure a property, if you have knowledge that that property is going to burn down, you can't invest on that property burning down, or you can't burn down the property and then collect on the insurance.
Right.
So that's what they were doing, and that's what everybody, on the end knows what they did, because ultimately, again, the size, the scope of the American housing industry within the global economy, particularly as it relates to consumption, I mean, it impacts the entire world, right? It had to be manifested ultimately by this financialization, because we hollowed out the middle class is really the ultimate point. But when you do that, because you also would refer to guys that that are known as quants. Quants are these genius, sophisticated mathematical specialists that write programs, and they know risk and they manage risk. And this is why they get paid a lot of money, as do the brokerage houses that manifest this. But as everybody knows, whether in air travel or in our streetlights or in buildings or building code, you have to have safety regulations to make all of those things work. So in the housing industry, we have a whole variety of guaranteed stopbacks that are there to make sure everything that you and I are talking about could never in a million years happen. Again, AAA, right? Legality. Nobody's above the law. The companies aren't above the law. People aren't above the law. But is that what happened, Egberto?
No, not at all.
The whole thing was not shenanigans. It was racketeering for modern executive compensation that led to the top echelon. We're talking about the too big to fail banks. We're talking about the hedge funds. We're talking about private equity. We're talking about, they all became uber billionaires in the ramp up. But when everything failed based on the largesse of racketeering and all of this fraudulent activity that led to the facade of these bonuses that were just stealing based on deceptive acts and practices, which is completely illegal, which is what manifested the entirety of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which are the police that regulate Wall Street, they didn't do their job. Even though they had thousands of warnings, thousands of pieces of evidence that went in front of them, everybody knew it was going to fail completely and disastrously, and yet nobody stopped it. And instead of holding the bad guys accountable, we gave them tens of trillions of dollars. So does that make
Interestingly, I want to add to that, because we have to also realize that a lot of the folks in the know that knew this stuff was going to collapse, they betted against the market, and they themselves they shorted the market.
Because they had inside information that it was going to blow. That's the whole point. And that's what nobody also understands.
They made billions in shorting a market that they knew was going down. I mean, I think...
Let me just tell you something real quick.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, so a lot of people have seen the movie The Big Short, and they're that explains everything that happened during the great financial
crisis. It's deeper.
It got about that much of it, and it got a lot of it wrong, but it got a lot right in the last 5 minutes when the writer, Adam McKay, brilliantly said all of the things that I'm telling you, but without the details, because obviously there's a lot of information. And a lot of people go glassy-eyed because they're like, okay, you had me on first base, but now you're going in all of these different directions, and I can't keep up because it's not out. Okay, you don't have to fly, you do not have the qualifications to fly a 747 unless you are trained and you work through the process, nor would you want to be on a plane with a pilot that doesn't know what he's doing, right?
Right.
So the point is, what I'm trying to tell the American people that are in 2024 right now, why is it that we have billionaires that have complete control of our government right now, and we have what is a criminal fascist president, Donald Trump, that has overcome the will of the American people to even see the forest for the trees? What world are we living in? What we're explaining to you is how this is manifested and how they operate.
Yeah, and sadly, when you mention about nobody going to jail for this, I want to get a quick side subject. I was a board member of the group called Move to Amend for some time.
Remember
we were
that.
trying to amend the Constitution to point out that money is not speech and corporations are not people. And you may ask, why am I bringing that up? Well, nobody went to jail. Why did anybody go to jail? Much of this was done under the veil of a corporation or LLCs or some third party entity that was abstracted from those actually committing the crime. When we speak about having to have not only legal structures, because our legal structure lends itself for fraud, that corporations are not people is a big methodology used to create fraud. Because you know what? If you're doing the fraud under the corporation can pay a fine. But after the corporation has paid its members, the corporation is gutted. It's gutted from whatever it has to pay anybody else. And the government can't go to the people. There's some exceptions to recover what was stolen. So in effect, in America, we have been worshiping thugs and thieves. The petty person that goes ahead and steals a cigarette, we want to lock them up, and we know what they look like, and excellent. These guys with suits and ties and nice speechologies, they are thugs that have caused more injury to you financially, and not only injury, but they've killed many more people than some of the criminals that are gang members, because their hurt has caused more damage to more people. Continue, my brother. I just needed to interject that.
Well, I'm so glad you did, because it gets right to the heart of the matter. And I'll get to Move to Amend in a moment, but you reminded me of what my colleague, Roseanne Rabbiola-Mele, always says. She calls them criminals in suits with no shame. And I call them financial terrorists, because, again, the law is always predicated on intent. Do you have an outcome in mind? Well, in this particular case, and I'll just cut to it because I see you're looking at a watch, but I want to make this sort of analogy to people that are kind of lost in translation. Guys, this type of activity has been going on for centuries in this particular way, okay? Everybody knows about imperialism. Does everybody understand the techniques of certain imperialism? It's called smash and grab. You typically go into a resource-rich community and you indenture slavery, and then you work with corrupt institutions to get them to basically get hooked on your currency so that you can have absolute control. That pretty much was the undergirding pinnings of the entire panoply of imperialism throughout, most of the 17th century, of course, which led to what? The American Revolution, which led to what? The idea of the Bill of Rights, the idea of separation of powers, the idea of the executive, the judicial, and the branches of government being separated, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. What are we talking about? We're talking about the law being, and by the way, this stuff is really simple in the end of the day. It's a street crime. That's it. Everybody understands when an old lady gets her purse stolen and a guy's running away who's a thug, should he be apprehended by the police? Well, yeah. Okay, what happens if you do that to tens of millions of widows around the United States, where you steal the home that is the most important thing to their ability to survive? It's phenomenally worse. I call that financial terrorism. I've said many, many times, Osama bin Laden couldn't in a million years come up with a scheme to do more damage to the United States than what our financial system did. But I do want to say this really quickly, because you have prefaced capitalism on several occasions, and we did go over it a moment ago. Capitalism requires, one, ideologically, risk reward. That's the whole point of capitalism. If you're going to compete and you do your homework and you compete to bring, see need, fill a need, bring things to market, and you get the upside because you did all the things right by the law, that's one thing. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is a system designed to fail, destroy everybody in its path, and then ultimately used the full faith and credit of the United States to illegally pay itself tens of trillions of dollars to hold itself above the law and above market forces. And what's a shortcut term for understanding what that is, Egberto? What would you call that?
It's fraud.
It's tyranny.
Fraud. It's tyranny. Yeah.
It's tyranny. It's corruption. It's tyranny. It's strong guy rule. It's oligarchy. It's kleptocracy. It's kakistocracy. It's all
and it's what our brother calls fraud. The model of capitalism, the model of the market, the model of Wall Street is what again?
That's what Bernie Sanders. He said, fraud. But he didn't give you the details of what I'm talking about. And that's important because he did say Wall Street's business model is fraud. And I want to go back to shenanigans. And when he said that on the in the debate with Hillary Clinton in Brooklyn in 2016, he made that claim, which is the most important claim. And that brought me to you, by the way.
Right.
But on that same stage, Hillary Clinton was asked the same question about why she was giving speeches to Goldman Sachs. And she said, well, because that's what they were willing to pay. And she talked about shenanigans as what they were up against or involved as opposed to fraud. Fraud is deceptive acts and practices. It's illegal theft by deception. It's not shenanigans, Hillary Clinton. It's fraud.
Yes, it is. It is actual fraud. Well, look, let's spend some time tying a few loose ends together. Sure. Specifically, you spoke about Hillary Clinton. You spoke about the involvement with BLM. Let's sort of tie these things together. Me Too and BLM erupt when the COVID, when we got COVID. How does all of that interact? Ukraine, the impeachment that was occurring in Ukraine. How is all of that tied to some of what we're talking about?
Wow. Well, it's a global economy for one, right? And, you're talking about huge things that have had impacts to the American people that we've all dealt with for the last 4 to 6 years. And so, starting with COVID, COVID, I don't know enough about COVID to make any I can only make general assessments. I can't give you high level detail of what actually manifested COVID with all of the theories and yada, yada, yada. What I can tell you, however, is that right before COVID, during the transition, I guess we're about halfway through the Trump administration with none other than Steven Mnuchin, a former Goldman Sachs high-level executive who became his Treasury Secretary, had unleashed Federal Reserve Act 13.3. Once again, as I had mentioned to you, the way we got to $49 trillion initially because of the 2008 Great Financial Crisis was because the Federal Reserve was circumnavigated, they circumnavigated Congress by allowing a direct infusion of capital to the financial class that had bankrupted the world through all of the racketeering that we've just spelled out, which was you give tens of trillions of dollars to criminals. What are you going to expect, right? They're going to do things like we talked to you about the other day, where somebody like Tish out of Manhattan can become the police commissioner in Manhattan, right? That kind.
Why again?
Exactly. But going into COVID, though, what I want you to understand is that we unleashed another $19 trillion for a global run on what was called, it was the same stuff that took place in 2008, but it was different products and different commodities. But it was based on the repo global structure, repo loans, which is overnight lending, because of some sort of hemorrhage that took place in Japan, in SoftBank out of Japan, who incidentally has all sorts of ties to Donald Trump's administration. This is before COVID. And what happened was suddenly $19 trillion appeared in the coffers of Wall Street. Once again, no congressional approval. We're talking about trillions of dollars.
COVID was the perfect excuse. Things like COVID and the COVID and whenever there's a disruption or anything like that, it gives them the perfect opportunity to steal.
Which led to repo loans, which led to not repo loans. What am I talking about? What am I talking about during the PPP loans, fraud, and also which happened immediately, right? But that all manifested through Steve Mnuchin. So And the reason he was able to do that, just so you know, is that there was a loophole built into Dodd-Frank, the 1,600-page legislation that followed the 2008 great financial crisis, that had one caveat to all of these monumental laws that they had set up so that nobody could ever do what happened to create the 2008 financial crisis. But Trump and company knew that. They got their boy Steve Mnuchin in. He backdoors, $19 trillion to the financial industry that nobody knows about. And then after that, we got knocked with COVID. And look, if I had the forensic ability and
wait, which one came first though? Did COVID come first or did that back channel come first?
That happened after. So the repo run happened right before COVID. It happened about, it was March 2020 for COVID. So I think it was 19. It was 2019 when this global overnight lending, that's called repo too. So
right.
Yeah, so that happened before COVID, but you got to understand what happened during COVID, because this is another manifestation of Federal Reserve Act 13.3 being used illegally. So you know how when Biden became president, we talked about the infrastructure project and all of these other elements that were like trillions of dollars, and people were kind of like aghast about that, and it led to all sorts of turmoil. But then he got it done. But you got to understand that all of the casinos, all of the cruise lines, all of the airlines, all of the emergency stimulus that took place during COVID came from the same methodology using Federal Reserve Act 13.3 to manifest the financing for this. What I'm telling you, Egberto, and your audience, is that the financial system found a way to work around Congress. Then they got idiots to get into Congress, whether it's George Santos, whether it's Marjorie Taylor Greene, whether it's Matt Gaetz, whether Warren Hobart. The rest, that was a faux pas. I meant to say Lauren Hobart. Sorry. That was my inner voice talking. Warren Hobart. But the bottom line is that none of these idiots have any idea of what's going on, and they're there just to be idiots to talk to other idiots, so they don't know what's going on either.
Exactly. I want folks to understand what the federal 1313 does is it gives the government, the feds, not the government, because the feds, remember the Federal Reserve is not the government. They are managed by governors appointed by the government, but they are
managed by governors appointed by the Fed. The head guy is appointed by the government.
But exactly. And remember, it's private sector, banking.
That's right.
And they get the ability to determine that these circumstances, that something going on in the United States is what they call unusual exigent circumstances. And under unusual exigent, they can take command and say, we're going to do whatever the hell we want to do because we have to protect the financial system of America, completely without control from the government. We, the people, understand how this system was made, not for you or controlled by you, but to let private bankers run the whole shebang. Continue,
Bingo, because what is the answer now, the qualified answer to how billionaires have complete control of the apparatus? When you look at whether it's Elon Musk, if you're thinking about Jeff Bezos, everybody in mainstream media is now trying to maneuver to where I am, except like, unfortunately, Kamala Harris, they wanted to turn the page and forget about all this stuff. You cannot understand what world you're living in unless you understand the methodology and the blueprint of the criminology that's involved.
In addition to that, my brother, we need to call them out as criminals by name.
That's right.
In other words, you got to call these criminals, these thugs out by name, because they are still wearing suits and they still command respect when they walk in town. Can I
give you the ultimate example of that?
Please do.
Okay, so there's a big to-do conference every year that's called Deal Book, that's orchestrated by a guy by the name of Aaron Ross Sorkin of the NY Times business section.
Yeah, and CNBC. He has this parade of financiers and global guys that you might see at Davos and everything else. But among those that are probably the chief architect and one of the biggest racketeers in the history of the world that everybody tends to always put, especially now in mainstream, especially the last leg of the last election cycle. And this is the problem with media. And this is why Trump is so funny when he says it's fake media, because he knows it is, because even the most
shall we say, prestigious mainstream media architects put Jamie Dimon, the CEO of Chase, as the guy who's basically the godfather, no pun intended, of our financial system, who's the guy that supposedly was able to get through all of these rough times in ways that ultimately worked out really well. Why? Well, because he was involved with the smash and grab that got tens of trillions of dollars to its institutions illegally.
Jamie Dimon, the Democrat who used to think that Donald Trump was full of it, suddenly made a change a few months before the election that, hey, he wasn't all that bad after all,
So Luigi Mangione goes after, Thompson at United Healthcare, not knowing that literally millions of Americans were set up and knocked down and had their houses stolen illegally that led to tens of thousands of divorces, suicides, homelessness, people that got rampaged in the system. And he's reading Ted Kaczynski, for example, right? What I'm trying to tell the American people is when you can't see the forest for the trees, you have no leverage. When you don't understand how the game is played, it's called asymmetry. And this is when people can deceive you. They can use all of the techniques of the hierarchy of the most genius legal scholars, economic scholars, and they can speak to you in a variety of speaking in tongues, especially through politicians that use platitudes to try to make believe or etch a sketch all this stuff away. Because when you're getting paid billions of dollars, like the great muckraking journalists that I emulate every single day, Upton Sinclair, the easiest way to get somebody to not understand something is if his paycheck depends on not understanding it. That's the reality of where we are. The answers that we're giving you exist at www.thecon.tv, .thecon.tv, and www.thecleannewdeal.org. Why is the Clean New Deal important? Because, for example, Egberto, today, of all days, Tom Hartman, who's kind of a seminal progressive pundit, who's a very intelligent guy who talks about a lot of things, but he doesn't talk about Federal Reserve Act 13.3 the way you just delivered it, which was absolutely just monumental, okay? Because nobody else has talked about this. But he was personifying the nature and the power of the New Deal and what it did for the American middle class that gave us the opportunity to have a housing, industry that was predicated on the fundamentals for decades. But that was predicated on the fundamentals for decades because we had learned the lessons of the Great Depression. We created the Securities and Exchange Commission that were the cops on the beat, and we created what was known as Glass-Steagall, which was the law to prevent banks from gambling with other people's money to ultimately railroad the system and use the entire system to pay itself trillions of dollars when it train wrecked everybody else. What could be more un-American than that, Egberto?
It's very un-American. Let me tell you something. I think what people have to realize is it is hard when you have learned about the American dream all your life. When you learn to equate capitalism with democracy, which makes absolutely no sense. When you've learned that the entire life, giving that up isn't easy. And if you're going to tell somebody you have to realize the truth, you better have the goods. One of the reasons when I saw you and I spoke after Bernie Sanders pointed out clearly that the Wall Street model is fraud. But when you presented the con and started giving these stories, it brought a whole lot more to light because you also had the most important things people lack, stories that they can see themselves in. And when you came out with the con, just about every adult who has a mortgage could look at that series and say, oh my God, that could be me, or that was me, or that is why.
It is all of us, because we're all in the same financial strata that this is all tied to.
Exactly. And when you see that, you can do something about it. The problem about it, my dear brother Patrick Lovell, is we have to get people to see it. We have to get people to hear it. And henceforth, this multi-part series with you singing the story over and over again. We're coming close to the time to end this segment. And the last bullet item that you had in here said the insurrection and the big lie campaign. I mean, we understand the electoral college and all of that. We've gone through a whole lot of this stuff many a times, but tie that in, the insurrection and the big lie, and that continues.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Thank you so much, Egberto. So this is my personal theory, but I want you to walk through the raindrops with me here. Okay. So we released The Con right about, let's say, September of 2020, because we wanted to build up, momentum that would land right before the presidential election, and then hopefully have everybody in the United States talking about this. There was some strange mechanics happening behind the scenes. Now, I've been a producer for over 2 decades. I used to work at the highest levels in Hollywood. I've been around a lot of major players.
Just tell them a couple of the things that you've produced, because just so the audience see, we're not just.
I worked for Paramount Pictures and Warner Brothers for some of the biggest names of Hollywood that you've seen. I produced the the Sundance Film Festival programming. But I'm talking about Men in Black. I'm talking about stuff for some of the biggest producers that you've seen in my career. Okay, so
right.
Big, Hollywood movies and all that stuff. I was a small guy in a big pond, working my way through the system. I ended up becoming an independent guy after I'd done a lot of stuff with the Sundance Film Festival. I worked with Robert Redford and Jennifer Aniston and Keanu Reeves, yada, yada, yada. Okay. But I had a front row seat, and I know how the business works because that's what I do. I'm a business guy, right? And I saw all different panoplies of how this whole thing works in terms of money and financing and all of these things that go into it. But so being at that level, okay, we had gotten represented by one of the top agencies in Hollywood, top 5. Okay, my agent was the same agent of none other than a woman by the name of, and I hope you recognize this name, Ava DuVernay. Ava DuVernay is a fabulous filmmaker. She did 13th on Netflix, which is about the systemic, basically slavery in prisons that, played to wide acclaim, all sorts of awards for her. And then she ended up doing When They See Us, which was the 4-part series of the Central Park 5, and everything that was tied to Donald Trump, right? Now, as it turns out, her probably biggest champion, and she's tied at the hip to, is none other than Oprah Winfrey. So we come in and I land a relationship with the same agent who represents us, because I'll never forget, Oprah Winfrey gave a speech at, I believe, the 2019, I think it was the Hollywood International Forum. It was one of the big, right pre-Academy Award speeches, where she gave a speech, and you might remember the speech, but she gave the speech about a woman who had accompanied on the same bus as Rosa Parks. And so she had been forever through, The Color Purple and many other things that she had been involved with, champions of the African-American experience, of course, right? But Oprah Winfrey is also a billionaire, and she's also a woman that has been involved at the highest levels of media and real estate for a very long time. She was also a champion of President Barack Obama, as you may recall. And more controversially, recently, she was getting paid to be a spokesperson for,
Kamala Harris.
Yeah. Why would you have to get paid, for example? Right.
Right.
That to me, look, those people who manage their business were representing us, but we didn't get out there. It felt like we were being quashed. Now, I can tell you after the fact that BlackRock ended up managing everything that I'm revealing to you by way of Federal Reserve Act 13.3. So a lot of people never heard of BlackRock. They didn't hear about Larry Fink until, the last several years, right? Fact is, Larry Fink's been around a long time. Larry Fink was involved with what we called the Resolution Trust. He was involved with cleaning up the savings and loan crisis, which I had revealed to you at the beginning of this dialogue. He's also known for Aladdin and many other things that are in the investment community. Obviously, one of the top money makers on Wall Street for his entire career. But Goldman Sachs was in a lot of trouble after the 2008 great financial crisis because of Matt Taibbi's fabulous work when he proclaimed them the great vampire squid. They needed to get the heat off of them. In the aftermath of when former Treasury Secretary, of course, which was the gentleman who came out of, it'll come to me in just, Timothy Geithner, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Timothy Geithner, during the Obama administration, it said, we're going to make the American people foam on the runway for the crashing financial system, which was a message, as at the time, a guy by the name of Hank Paulson was saying this at the same time, that he had a bazooka that he was able to use to save the the international investment community. He was sending messages that, don't worry about it, we've got this taken care of. There was 98 meetings behind the scenes that manifested through Federal Reserve Act 13.3, $33 trillion in 2009, another $16 trillion between 2009, 2017-ish. And then in 2019, we had another $22 trillion that came through the Trump administration via the same situation. And then there's stuff that happened during the Biden administration because the runs with the banks at Silicon Valley Bank, which is, of course, tied to Peter Thiel and all the billionaire class, okay? All of this money has been fueled behind the scenes illegally that benefited the billionaire class and the billionaire aristocracy, of which was managed by none other than BlackRock. BlackRock was also on all of the boards of HBO, Time Warner, Netflix, yada, yada, yada. I have reason to speculate, and it's only speculation just based on somebody who's been there, done that they had to quash the con. They had to quash the con because we give the evidence, the material led by none other than William K. Black, the greatest criminologist in the history of the United States. My apologies to Ferdinand Pecora, who is my personal hero, and we'll get to him at some point. But he's the one who gave us all the stuff that took place after the great.
Now, how did they squash you?
We didn't get distribution. We ultimately were dying on the vine. We had to make our incredible work that puts together it's a $71 trillion truth. We had to make it for free because all the American people buy our lies. And so we made it for free, where you can see it at www.thecon.tv. By the way, that's a misnomer. We didn't make it for free. We spent millions of dollars to get the information, to do the work that took thousands and thousands of hours, and working with the top people from the FBI, the DOJ, the SEC, and everybody that put this thing together for us. We did the work, Egberto, that the $90 billion apparatus of the Department of Justice, the SEC, the FBI, and AGs around the country could not do for the American people because of corruption. That's how monumental the corruption is, Egberto.
Well, look, we have to close it out here till our next series. So give me about a 1 minute closer for this particular section, the billionaire domination.
Absolutely. So I want to thank you, Egberto, and I want to thank your audience for tuning in. We hope you share this. We have a composite understanding of a criminal class that is not a capitalist class, even though, of course, capitalism is what enables it all. It's crime. So there's a big difference between racketeering and just business. If the law isn't maintained or if it doesn't have integrity, you all know it. You're looking at Donald Trump. You're looking for answers. You're asking yourself, how is it possible that Elon Musk and Bezos and Patrick Soon-Chung of the LA Times and all of these people can suppress what you all know to be true? That there's two different apparatuses of the law in this country. The law for all of us that we all have to abide by. Otherwise, we go to jail, which we don't want to lose our jobs and our families and everything that we've invested so much to accomplish. And that of the criminal class that has complete control of the arteries of money, that have completely betrayed the democracy that depends on the integrity of law, where no man or person is above the law, and they took Congress out of the mix. That, my friends, is the largest con in history.
Patrick Lovell, producer of The Con, where he discussed the fraudulent mortgage. I'm going to call it, for his sake, the racketeering that took down the economy in 2008. It's been my honor to have you on once again, Patrick. Thank you so kindly for being on Politics Done Right.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead. Number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.